Hey everybody, this is Mo. I just had a few notes that I wanted to talk about before I present this podcast of George R.R. Martin talking about Game of Thrones. Very excited about this. It was recorded Saturday, September 1st at Chicon 7, which is the 70th Annual World Science Fiction Convention. It's George talking for about 70 minutes with myself and Peter Sagal, who you may know from the radio show Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me. So we asked George a lot of stuff, and it turned out to be, I thought, a very wide-ranging and interesting discussion about craft and about the themes of Game of Thrones. In terms of spoilers and whatnot, I don't think you'll encounter anything that you don't want to know. For the most part, if you haven't read the books, I think you're fine. There are a few allusions to things that I think are so vague that I don't think they'll ever ruin a possible book reading experience. There's also a couple of questions that are a little bit harder to hear. About minute 46 or 47, there's a question that is not very audible. That all you need to know about that is it's about Daenerys and the dragons. And at about an hour and 6 or 7 minutes in, there's a question that is also a little bit hard to hear. And that really just relates to the process of writing different characters. And the questioner asked which character George enjoyed writing the most or had the most affinity for writing. The final thing to know is that the panel began with George asking for some water to be brought to him. And there's a little bit of a joke that follows on from that. So here it is, and I really hope you enjoy it.
It amazes me that you, of all people, would drink a beverage brought to you by someone you don't know. Oh, okay.
That's true.
Hi, should we start?
Yes, sure.
I have two surprises for you. The first surprise is, hi, I'm Peter Sagal. How are you? I will tell you that I just wanted to come and sit in the back because I've become a huge fan of George and his stuff. In fact, I was years ago when I came to the 1980 World Science Fiction Convention. You were one of my favorite writers then, so I'm pleased to be here now. That's the first surprise that I'm here. The second surprise,
1980 here in Chicago.
No, it was in Boston.
Boston, that's right. I won 2 Users that year. That was a nice year.
And this is my first one since then, so I'm glad to be back. That's the first surprise. The second surprise is that George will, of course, have me unexpectedly killed halfway through. Really, you guys would be like, really? Was that necessary? Really?
But if it's really bloody, we'll be like, okay.
So, anyway, but like I said, I just wanted to be here as a fan, and instead they're having me sit up here, so I will be very brief and very grateful to be here. And let me introduce your panel for this session. On my far right is Maureen Ryan, also known as Mo. She's the former TV critic of the Chicago Tribune here in Chicago, and now the TV critic for the Huffington Post. And to my immediate right, the man who's responsible for making HBO even dirtier than it was before. The author of Song and Ice and Fire and many, 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 many other great, great things, Mr. George R.R. Martin. Right?
Thank you.
I was kind of hoping for me, but I'll take water.
Dornish Red.
Dornish Red, something like that.
Oh, it's good to be with you guys.
Thanks for being here. I'm very excited. And the panel instructions said that I should ask a really general, non-specific, easy question at first, so I'm not going to do that.
Okay.
I'm going to ask a really specific one, because this one that was actually kind of, rolling around in my brain too. Mance Rayder, we have a casting for that character on the show, so that's exciting.
We do?
Yes, we do.
CRN Hines,
yes.
Of course, who played Julius Caesar in HBO's wonderful
he's awesome.
Version of Rome, which is one of my favorite shows. I still miss it. So he's fantastic.
And one fan had asked, and I took a ton of fan questions before this began, and of course we'll get to your questions as well in a bit. How old is Mance meant to be?
I don't think I ever specify an age. I probably saw him as roughly equivalent of the age of Corin Halfhand, the two of them as contemporaries. It's mentioned that Mance has gray in his hair, so he's clearly not a young man. Yes, he's about to be a father for the first time, but his wife is considerably younger than he is. Of course, that's not entirely unusual in either the real world or in Westeros, where 70-year-olds marry 12-year-olds. So I don't think that really establishes much about his age. So it's a broad range.
And you were happy with the casting, given what a fan of Rome you were?
Oh yeah, he's amazing. So I'm interested in seeing, what he brings to it. He's done a lot of other things besides Rome, of course. So
he was in the movie Munich, for example. Mm-hmm. He's a fantastic actor.
There's a Jane Austen adaptation called Persuasion, which if you don't know Mr. Hines' work, you should look up. It's very not Mance-like role, but he's just he has a great presence, I think. He has a very charismatic way about him.
I'm not sure if he can actually sing, which is something we'll find out because Mance, of course, in the books poses as a bard on several occasions and is always strumming things on a lute and belting out the Dornishman's wife or something. Will they maintain this aspect of the character, or can Ciaran sing? Will they dub his singing voice? I don't know. We'll find out.
He's an Irishman. He will sing regardless. In my experience. And then I wondered if it was in your contract at any point that Diana Rigg must appear in the show. Because I'm picturing you as a huge Avengers fan, old school Avengers, of course.
Yes, I it was actually very exciting for me, but also startling for me when we cast Diana Rigg, because of course the Queen of Thorns is grandmother, and Diana Rigg in my head will always be Mrs. Peel in that cat suit, and I think the sexiest woman on television, certainly when I was growing up.
So you're saying there's no cat suit in the new season, because that's a deal breaker?
Probably not. Probably not.
Disappointing. And then just, again, another specific question, which I wasn't supposed to ask at the top. What episode are you writing? Do you know that? Have you already begun it?
I've already finished it. For season 3, it's called episode 7. It's called Autumn Storms, which title I'm not entirely thrilled with, but it was the best I could come up with. The first 2 episodes I wrote sort of titled themselves. They were pretty easy, but I niggled on this one for a long time, but it rains a lot in the episode, so and it's autumn, so autumn storms. We may change that if I can come up with something better, but it's the 7th episode of the 10-episode arc.
And I won't ask you specifically about what you're writing about in that episode, but they tend to give you these incredibly hard to pull off kind of nightmare script assignments. But I mean, obviously they're not nightmares because it's great parts of the story, but I'm sure I'm not alone in thinking the Battle of the Blackwater was the best episode of last season. Also a tough one to write.
Is that done out of a sense of vengeance? Like, you thought up this damn thing, you scripted?
Yeah, I think Dave and Dan did have a bit of that going on in the back of their mind there. The Battle of Blackwater was quite a plum. I was very excited that I did get to write it, even though it didn't include many of my favorite characters. So I missed having a chance to write about like Arya, for example, who's totally absent, or Dany. The episode is just focused on the Blackwater, but that gave it a certain unity, which I think made it work very well. The hard part about writing it, of course, is, killing your children. I knew going in that...
For you?
I don't mind killing...
That was your hobby.
I don't mind killing characters, but I don't like to kill or lose, good bits. And the Battle of Blackwater, as it appears in the book, would have cost the budget of a Peter Jackson film to film. And we did lose. I was very happy that so many of you guys out there liked it so much, because we did have to lose a lot. We lost the chain right away. That was like the first thing going in. David and Dan told me right off, we can't do the chain. I said, well, okay, we can't do the chain, but we have the bridge of boats. No, we can't do the bridge of boats. Okay, well, we'll have the three whores throwing the antler mitt. Nah, we can't do the three whores. So we lost that, but we managed to keep a lot of good stuff, and the wildfire, which really made it. And then with the plum on top of the pudding there, we got Neil Marshall to direct it, who's amazing director who had never done television before and came in really at the last moment when the originally scheduled director had a family emergency, and the job he did with it was just phenomenal.
Can I ask a question about the writing of the TV show? Each episode has so many, shall we say, mini chapters in the ongoing saga of each individual character. We jumped from Beyond the Wall, we're back in the Red Keep. When you get your episode to write, are you told, okay, we have to take this character to this beat, that character to this beat, this meeting, this incident, and you have to do all of that in the outline, or is it more flexible?
Well, basically, Dan and David, and assisted by Brian Cogman and Vanessa Williams, have a writing room, and they sit down and break the season. Mostly Dan and David, I think. Brian's been part of the process. And they look at what we can do and what we can't do, and divide it into the 10 episodes, and try to decide where the cliffhangers are all going to fall, and work out the rough beats, and then at some point they decide who's going to write what episode too. I write one per season by my deal. I'd like to do more, but then you would never get the books. Even fitting in one per season into my schedule is sometimes feels very tough. And Brian writes one. Vanessa wrote, I believe, 2 this last season, and David and Dan do the rest. So, and they tell me what episode they want me to write. It's partly a negotiation too. I tell them what episode I'd like to write, but deadlines have a lot to do with it. I mean, sometimes I'm traveling. I travel a lot, probably more than I should, and they know what date they need the first draft by. And, usually I say, ooh, can I do a later episode than that? I can't possibly have anything by then because I will be in Kazakhstan. So we work it out one way or another.
I have a question that I think, I think as fans, most of us, or all of us, hopefully realize that there have to be changes between the books and the TV show, and that, they're going to be kind of different animals or almost parallel but different stories. And one thing that has come up quite a bit in discussions I've had with fans is that the House of the Undying in the season finale, there was not as much there as obviously as in the books. And I guess for my 2 cents is that to put everything in would have probably blown the budget. But there seems to be a choice that the creators or that Dan and David have made that it's more about an examination of power and being powerful and powerless and how you shift between those worlds, and there's less of the kind of mythology over thousands of years. Is that something that you think is, an appropriate choice for the show to make? Were you ever upset about the House of the Undying stuff?
Well, there's just sort of a general question, a specific question there. A lot of the material in the House of the Undying in the books is in the nature of prophecy, and also some glimpses into the past. And I can do that in the books because I know, roughly when and where it's going to be paid off. You'd really have to talk to David and Dan and get a precise explanation of why they made the choices they made in that particular scene. But I think some of it maybe they were a little leery of the prophecy because we don't know how many seasons we're going to have or how many hours we're going to have each season, and would some of these plot threads later on have to be eliminated? And if so, it would sort of be stupid to have a whole prophecy of something that never pays off down the road because we have to cut that thread or cut that character or something for budgetary reasons. They have been not doing a lot with the prehistory, the flashbacks, the stuff that occurred 16 years ago, 20 years ago, 300 years ago. I mean, there's some references to it. but not a lot. And sooner or later, they are going to have to deal with, I think, Rhaegar and Lyanna and what happened between them, and the Battle of the Trident, and all of these things, and the Mad King. I know for the first season they did shoot some flashback scenes with the Mad King, but they were never included in the final take. So I don't know. It's an interesting question to see how they're going to handle that, because certainly in the books, the past, the present, and the future, all reflect upon each other and are included part of it. I mean, this also gets into a larger issue of exposition, and I know that you critics have coined this sexposition term, which has become widely adopted and part of the discussion of the show. But if you even pushing aside the sex part of sexposition as to a separate issue, which we can discuss at some point if we wish, and just looking at the exposition part, there's a tremendous amount of exposition in the books. Exposition is easy to do in a novel. I can just have my character think about, we're passing the castle. This castle has been here for 400 years. It was originally, the Mad Lord Bertram lived there, and he ate all of his children. And it looks ominous even now. But, of course, when you're filming, you have to put that in the mouth of someone. You have to have them writing past, and someone actually has to say that unless you're going to do a voiceover and all that. So either you lose the exposition, or you have a lot of people kind of giving historical lectures along the way, or talking about the deep, dark secrets of their own personal youth. And this is the challenge. As a novelist, I have many tools of narrative, and exposition is one of them. Exposition through internal monologue, exposition simply through expository prose. I mean, a paragraph in a book, a paragraph of expository prose is nothing. You read it and it's over, and then you're right on to the action. You hardly notice the speed bump in the road. But in a TV show, it's a big thing where suddenly somebody starts talking about history for a minute on screen. A minute on screen is a lot more than a minute's worth of reading material in a novel.
I want to jump in here and say very briefly, one of the reasons I'm so excited to be here is when I was a kid in 1980, I was reading all this science fiction, walking into walls, and then I grew up and put it aside and did more serious things, and which seemed like a good idea at the time. And then last year, yes, I'm late to it. I picked up a Game of Thrones, and the next thing I know, I'm walking into walls again for the first time in 30 years because I can't take my nose out of the book. And I'm curious as to how you did this to me. Because I'm like, how did he do this? I thought I was above and beyond this, and I'm not, obviously.
It was sheer brilliance.
So I have some questions about the book and about the books and your skills, and I want to see if I can get some tips from you in case I ever want to write a historically great fantasy series. First, about that. Why didn't you start a Game of Thrones with the Baratheon Rebellion? Because you know everything about it. Why do you start 16 years after its events?
I didn't know everything about it, actually. I sort of found out about it as the characters did as I went on. And so there's a lot of the process of discovery. In some ways, I think, particularly in the early books, but the process is still ongoing. I'm writing forwards and backwards at the same time. I'm revealing what's happening in the present of the book, and through devices like internal monologue and exposition and so forth. I'm also revealing what happened 16 years ago. And the process of the revelation of what happened during Robert's Rebellion is particularly interesting, I think made more interesting because I'm revealing it through a series of point of view characters who have a different recollection of it. The equivalent in real life terms is sitting down and discussing the Vietnam period with all things. I have very strong memories of the Vietnam War from someone who was clean Virginia McCarthy kind of guy, demonstrating here at Northwestern and let us get out of Vietnam. Very different perspective on the war than somebody like Joe Haldeman, who went to Vietnam and got his ass shot off, or various other people, and or some conservative who was all for the war and all that. I mean, we all have these events took place, but what actually took place? We're reflecting into the past, and I find that very interesting. Which is another difference, of course, between television and books. As a prose writer, I have the structure of a viewpoint character, but the camera is an objective viewpoint. When we present the flashback, we're saying this is exactly how it happened. We can't necessarily, unless we do a full-on Rashomon kind of thing, where we present several versions of the same scene. The whole idea of subjectivity and different people remembering events in different ways and having different interpretations of things that happen is very difficult to do in television or film.
Well, sure, I understand. And one of the things that makes the character so compelling is, like the rest of us, as you say, they're walking around with the burden of the past, like we do. And so when you started, when you sat down and like, here we are, how much did you know about what they knew? Had you conceived this entire political turmoil prior? Or they just started telling you what they thought about where they were at the time?
I've often said that there are two types of writers. There are the architects and the gardeners. And the architects know where everything is, just like an architect designing a house in their novel. They know before they even drive the first nail or even buy the wood to make the house, they know where the pipes are going to run and how many rooms they're going to be and how many square feet in each room and where the electrical outlets are going to be. And it's all right there in the blueprint. The gardeners just dig a hole and throw in a seed and water it, in the case of a writer, with their blood. And, they have some knowledge. It's not a total crapshoot. They know whether they planted a tulip or an oak tree. But, it could be a different colored tulip, or the oak tree could be stunted and twisted, and you find out about that. And I'm much more of a gardener than I am an architect. So writing for me is a process of discovery. It's a journey. I know the ultimate end. I know how the story ends. I know the fate of all the major characters. But a lot of the details are things that I discover in the process of writing and discovered during the journey. That's what makes writing so much fun for me.
Are the things that surprise us as readers so much, from the very beginning when Bran gets thrown out the window to the Red Wedding to all kinds of other things that hit us full square in the face, did they hit you that way, or did you know?
I knew all those things ahead of time. Those things were all carefully planned, or as carefully planned. Well, it's a question of what. All right. Let me phrase this carefully. When I say I knew them all ahead of time, well, how to define ahead of time? I mean, when I began this, I knew nothing. It came out of the blue. I was working on another novel when I started it. But at some point, where the book was really starting shape, those pieces fell into shape. But a lot of other things have come in. I mean, I originally sold this as a trilogy. It was only supposed to be 3 books, and now, I'm working on book 6 of the trilogy. So it has grown over time and over years. But the principal turning blocks, the principal set pieces, and the big shocking moments, I knew all along.
A lot of people, and then I'll toss back to you, Marie. A lot of people, including myself, read the books and we're like, man, he is so messing with our expectations. And do you ever, just as a writer who had been in the business a long time, ever say to yourself, I'm going to mess with these people. I'm going to introduce an absolutely adorable child. I'm going to make everybody love him in 5 pages, and then I'm going to cripple him. And that'll show the bastards.
I don't think about it in quite those ways. But I think the general impulse is there, yes. Long before I was a writer, I was a reader. I was a reader, I was a watcher of television, I was a watcher of movies, and all of these things. And I still do. I love to read, I love fiction, I love movies, I love television shows. And the one thing that I hate more than anything else is predictability. I hate reading a novel where you read the first chapter and you know exactly how it's going to end. And then, if you do plow on and read the rest of it, gosh, it does exactly what you thought it was going to do. And there's never a surprise in it. I don't like that in movies. I don't like that in television shows. It bores me. And we've all read. I mean, I hate to think, if you count up how many books I've read, how many movies I've seen, how many television shows I've watched in a lifetime, it seems true for all of you. So I think you have to shake up the rules a little and get the damn readers awake or viewers awake and take them in places that they don't expect to go. And that's hard. It's very hard. My first experience on television writing was on the revival of the Twilight Zone in the mid-'80s. And I grew up watching the original Twilight Zone, Rod Serling show. I'm sure many of you here at the Science Fiction Convention remember the Rod Serling show. And the Rod Serling show was famous for its twist endings. You all know that, right? Burgess Meredith breaks his glasses. Anne Francis is a mannequin. The girl that we think is getting made, the ugly girl is actually beautiful, and the beautiful people are ugly, and all that. Wonderful, wonderful episodes in 1959 and 1960. So we're back in 1987 here. We're 85, 86, 87. We're doing the new Twilight Zone, and we got CBS all over our ass here, our network, saying, why don't your shows have twist endings like the original? People want twist endings. And what a problem is that the audience in 1986 was much more sophisticated than the audience in 1959. They could see all of these twist endings come a mile away. We tried to do a remake of the mannequin episode. We did remakes, and everybody knew that the lead character was a mannequin. We didn't fool anybody for an instant. So it's harder to be unpredictable because we've all seen so many television shows and so many movies, and we've seen these things. So, but I do strive for it. I don't say I always succeed, but I do strive for it. I think it makes for more involving entertainment.
Yeah, please. Go ahead.
I don't want to get in the way of everything else you plan. This just picks up on something I mentioned a moment ago when I was talking about Bran in the first book. In 5 pages, you make us love him, which is something that you do consistently, be it love or any other feeling that you seem to want us to have. I think specifically of some of the prologues and the epilogue, I think to one of the books where you introduce a character we haven't known before within paragraphs. We know who this person is, man or woman. We have a feeling about this person. We understand them. We're invested in them. That, to me, as someone who has written in my life, seems like a magical power. And I wanted to know if you could say, just talking about craft for a second, if you have techniques to do that. If there's something that you know that you can share with us now about how to create these characters so vividly and so quickly.
Well, I use a very tight third-person viewpoint structure. As a writer, you have a variety of ways that you can tell a story. You can use first person, of course, and I've done that occasionally in my life, where the character is actually saying, "I did this, I did that." That has the effect of someone who is actually telling a story. And when people tell a story, sometimes they lie. So that can be sort of interesting. But you can also do third person objective, third person omniscient, where you're God, you're looking down, and you're just describing what's happened, or you're entering the minds of any character. One moment you're in the waitress's mind, the next moment you're in the customer's mind, the next moment you're in a cook's mind. That's omniscient viewpoint. Or you're God, you know what everybody's thinking. Or objective, where you don't enter anyone's mind. And this is a current favorite, I think, of a lot of literary writers, where you just describe actually what's happening. You never enter anyone's thoughts. Obviously, I don't use any of these techniques. I pick a single viewpoint character and I go heavily inside their thoughts. So you not only hear what they're saying, but you hear what they are thinking. But only the one person. I don't like omniscient because we're not God. We don't experience stories that way. We experience stories through our single point of eyes. I'm looking, you're all looking up at us here, and I'm looking out at you. And we have very different viewpoint things. If suddenly a giant cockroach started crawling up the wall behind us, some of you might react there, and I would have no idea what was happening. Why are these people looking so strangely at us? And that's the way human beings live life and all that. And at the same time, making you intimate to the character's thoughts, I think, enables you to get who they are and what's important to them. And that's why I don't like the strictly objective viewpoint where we just say, well, what I said, what I do, which is much more of almost a cinematic technique. I mean, something written in third-person objective is what the camera sees, because unless you're doing a voiceover, which is tremendously clumsy, you can't hear the ideas of character. So for that, we depend on subtle clues that the directors put in and that the actors supply. I can actually write, yes, you can trust me, he lied. How do you do that on...
That goes unstated, sir. We expect that.
Yeah.
Well, actually, speaking of the point of view technique, do you write all of the characters' point of views all in one chunk and then sprinkle it throughout a book, or do you kind of have goalposts or signposts in the road that you want to follow and you decide who's going to be the person to take us on that part of the journey? How do you actually implement it?
I don't write the chapters in the order in which you read them. I do switch. I'll get in a Tyrion group. I'll write 4 or 5 Tyrion chapters, and then I'll hit a stopping point or something like that, or I'll realize I'm way ahead on Tyrion, and I got to catch up with the other characters, and I'll go back and switch to Arya or Sansa or something. It's always difficult switching gears because the characters have very different voices, very different ways of looking at the world. So even if I'm writing up a good storm and doing pages every day, the minute I switch to a new character, it's that first day is, oh God, I better reread all the characters again. I have Sansa sounding like Tyrion. That's not good. Let me read more of her chapters and immerse myself in Sansitude and try to get that better. So there's always that switching between one character and another.
Just to follow on from what Peter was asking about, I think one of the things that you do so well by having that tight focus on each person is explore, I just want to kind of get back to the idea of power that I was talking about earlier, that I think one of the things that's so involving about the stories is that the people who start out with power might be quite limited in some ways and can lose power, and that ups the stakes. And the people who are allegedly powerless with the right kind of cunning and guile and smarts and, even heart, they can find ways out of, situations that seem hopeless. Was that sort of an idea that was in the back of your mind when you set out to start to do this, to sort of examine those ideas about power and hierarchy and how those things aren't as fixed as people might think that they are? Yeah,
definitely. The whole subject of power is fascinating to me. Both in a historical context and in a real context. I mean, how does power work? What's it based on? Varys's riddle, which I was very glad that they included, I think is one of the most important parts of the book, where he asks Tyrion, who has the real power in that situation, where the rich man and the priest and the king are each telling the sellsword to kill the other people. It's actually the sellsword who has the power, in a sense. He's the one who has the sword in his hand. He has the power of life and death over the other 3. But he is going to obey one of the other 3 because of some illusion of power. And yet these are, when I see that scene played out in my mind's eye, these are like 3 old fat guys. And, the sellsword, none of them can actually do anything themselves to the sellsword. And yet they command him somehow because they can summon other sellswords. Well, why do those other sellswords obey? I mean, this whole notion of what power is our societies are built on this structure of sand. All societies, and you see that periodically with the falls of great empires and nations. The Soviet Union, it looked solid and eternal, this gigantic police state, and one day it just blew away. It was, we're not going to follow those guys anymore. Let's get rid of them, and we'll bring in some new guys. And suddenly the Soviet Union was gone overnight. Why does that happen? I was reading a book a couple months ago, A Popular History of Jerusalem, a fascinating book by Montefiore, I believe it was. Whole history of Jerusalem from biblical prehistory and the Maccabees and the Jewish state and all that, right to modern day Jerusalem. And fascinating history. I mean, Jerusalem has been through so many different things: the Crusaders and the Turks and the Arabs and the Jewish empires early on, the Romans. Everybody's had Jerusalem at some point, and then usually they've murdered a lot of other people here. But I was reading about this one particular crazy sultan or caliph or something during the Islamic thing who was clearly nuts. At one point, he decided his doctors were trying to kill him, so he had all of his doctors killed. Okay. Medical reform in its most primitive area. But then he decided that the women of the women of the court were conspiring against him. But he liked women because they had like babies and other uses sexually and stuff like that. So he didn't want to have them all killed. So he commanded his guard to cut off the hands of all of the women in the court. Not only like his own wives and concubines, but evidently their wives and concubines as well. And they did it. Now, what the hell is going on there? Why doesn't like the captain of the guard say to the sergeant, this guy is fucking nuts. We have swords. He's this poncy little guy going around here. Why don't we kill him instead of cutting off our wives' hands? I don't know. Where does the power come from? But it's a fascinating issue to explore. And, huge drama comes out of that. And, don't be surprised if sometime in Ice and Fire I have some crazy king cut off the hands of a whole bunch of people.
Well, I think I anticipate that.
You can't make up this stuff, by the way. I mean, that's where, you read enough history and, boy, it's all just there, The people who accused my books or the TV show of being, exceptionally bloody have obviously never read about the real Middle Ages or the history of Jerusalem or some of the things that actually happened in real life. I mean, this is like Disneyland in Western compared to some of the things that really happened.
I think that's the first comparison of Disneyland to Westeros I've ever heard.
Theme park people.
I don't want to ride those rides.
They end badly. Can I throw more? All right. Another one of my obsessions. One of the things I was so struck by reading the books and getting into them was how much, and this to me was unique in the fantasy that I was reading, I've ever read, is the overriding concern of parents and children. There are parents and children throughout. In fact, I had this idea after reading Game of Thrones that you could do a tie-in book called Rob Not Joff, Parenting the Game of Thrones Way. Really, we'll put this on Kickstarter, people. We'll make it happen. But it is true that people are so influenced by their parents, how well they were raised, how poorly they were raised. You don't have children, right?
I don't, no. But I was one once.
I understand. Well, that's my question. Where do you get your, seeming to me, very profound insights into parenting and children and how children relate to their parents and vice versa?
I don't know. You do draw on your own upbringing and of course on things you read and things that you see around you. Parenting is a fascinating issue. I suppose it's true that I had certain issues with my own father, and maybe some of that is being reflected in the variety of people in the books who have father issues. Although my father issues were never like their father issues. Yeah. Where do you get any of this stuff? It's sometimes it's hard to know. But it's an important issue, and one thing you really read about it if you read Middle Ages, the history of the real Middle Ages, and even Rome and other things is it was all about families. Their primary loyalty was always to the family, not to the society or some concept. I mean, nationalism was a later concept. When we read about the 100 Years' War, we think of it, looking at it from a modern viewpoint, that it was a war between France and England. Well, no, not really. Not really. It was a war between two branches of the same dynasty that were competing. The descendants of the Capetian dynasty, against the Valois dynasty, which was trying to come in. It was cousins fighting each other. In some ways, not unlike the Starks and the Lannisters. Or the Yorks and the Lancasters in the later Wars of the Roses. So a lot of these things were families.
I'll tell you that I read Game of Thrones, and I made the mistake of comparing myself as a father to Eddard Stark, which is a mistake. Don't do that. But I was getting kind of upset, and I said to my 11-year-old daughter, I have 3 daughters, I said, I bet that if I were taken prisoner by my enemies, you guys wouldn't raise an army to release me. And my 11-year-old daughter immediately came back, well, how could we? You've never gotten us swords.
What's one of your primary failings as a parent?
Apparently. I didn't arm them.
I'd like to rectify that.
That's true. I'm sure there's something in the dealer's room I can bring home.
Valerian steel makes an excellent line of replicas. You can get needles for your 11-year-old daughter, but just make sure you get Robert's Warhammer for yourself.
I think so. Well, it's interesting just to be serious and glum about the funny thing that just talked about. I think that what you got at too with the whole issue of the whole the captain of the guard not going against the sultan or the kids not just having this huge influence of the parents. To me, what really resonates in your work, too, is that people are torn between what they know and the fear of the unknown. And you might have a terrible stepfather or father or castle that you're living in or situation that you're in, but you know that situation, you know that city, you know that place, and what you don't know is more terrifying. And I think that that's one of the most useful devices that are things that you do in the stories, and I think this TV show reflects this, is that people are torn between the bad known choice and the unknown, possibly horrific choice. There's no really but here's the great choice, which will be wonderful and everything will work out. There isn't ever that. Is that an idea that really resonates for you as a writer? Just the fear of the unknown and people clinging on to what they do know, even if it's not great.
Well, certainly in the question of people making choices, interests me. Why people do make the choices that they make. I've always quoted as one of my guiding principles as writer Faulkner's Nobel Prize acceptance speech, where he said that the only thing worth writing about was the human heart in conflict with itself, and I think there's a great deal of truth to that. We talk about science fiction as literature of ideas and fantasy as literature of imagination, and I love ideas, I love imagination, but still ultimately it comes down to characters and it comes down to the human heart in conflict with itself, and us making these difficult decisions in difficult situations. I was talking about this with a friend who has a young daughter just a couple days ago, and the whole question beginning with Jamie and Bran. Obviously, a lot of people when Jamie throws Bran out the window, and we like Bran, we've seen his viewpoint, we tend to think that makes Jamie a bad guy. Okay, but then if you understand the situation, if Bran goes back and tells what he saw and is believed, Jamie will be put to death, his sister will be put to death, and there's excellent chance that his own children will be put to death. So I said to my friend, okay, what would you do if some other 8-year-old kid, was in a position to say something and you knew that would mean the death of your own young daughter? And he said, that 8-year-old kid is dead. And this is what we would consider moral man. So how do you make that choice, the abstract of morality versus the lives of your own children? To me, I don't know that I'm a proselytizer who says this is the answer to that. I mean, the question, the painful, difficult question, the difficulty of the choice. That's what I think makes powerful fiction.
Yeah, I mean that's what I think. One of the things I certainly respond to is this idea that there was this structured society and everyone kind of knew what stratification they were at. That's an appealing concept. Or that there's a family and you know what the role of the parents are, and you know what the role of the kids are and how they're going to respond. But then there are these things that come along that put you in conflict. And one of the things that's great about the books is that there are, you might have an allegiance to your house, to your family, to your sibling, to your parent that is in conflict with your allegiance to your army or some other group that you're part of. I mean, that's not even a question. I'm just rambling now. So, but that's a great way that you lard the books with these choices that really are, at some point something bad will happen no matter what you choose, which is what makes for good reading. I wanted to throw it open at this point for questions, and I don't know how people normally do it. Do people just normally stand up and take and talk?
Raise their hands and they shout out here.
Go ahead.
Would you comment, sir, on your relationship with the number 7?
Well, it's a nice number. It's a prime number, so it's not divisible, and it's historically a lucky number. And it seemed to make a good number for my gods. I wanted to have a version of the Catholic faith, which has the Trinity, and so I looked for another number. I could have gone with 5, but I went with 7 instead. It seemed to balance out nicely and allow me to include the stranger, who was the most interesting part of that pantheon of 7. It was really just one god with 7 aspects, just as I was told as a kid that there was only one god, but he had 3 personae, so... There are some times while writing Ice and Fire that I say, did it really have to be 7 kingdoms? 5 kingdoms good enough? Oh, man, it's hard to keep track of all these damn people.
This lady up here.
How did you come up with the character of Khaleesi?
The what?
The dragon mother?
You mean Khaleesi
Khaleesi, yeah.
or Daenerys?
You mean, how did I come up with the name?
No, how did you construct her character? How did you...
Boy, I don't know how to answer that question. They just, it comes from somewhere. If I knew where it comes from, I would bottle it and sell it. But, I knew I wanted to, that I started with the concept of having the exiled former kings who had been driven some time away across the water trying to regain their throne. And right from the first, I found Dany more interesting than Viserys. So I wanted to play with that and also play with showing a frightened girl becoming a powerful woman, coming into her own power and slowly realizing that. And of course, the dragons. The dragons were one aspect that I did consider not including very early in the process. I was debating, should I do this just as like historical fiction about fake history and have no actually overt magic or magical elements. But my friend Phyllis Eisenstein, a wonderful fantasy writer who lives here in Chicago, I happened to be talking to her at a very early page in the process. And Phyllis has written some great fantasies herself. And she said, nah, you have to have dragons. You have to it's a fantasy, And so I dedicated Storm Solstice to Phyllis, who made me put the dragons in. And I think that was the right thing to do. Of course, the dragons symbolize... the dragons work on all sorts of symbolic and metaphorical levels, but also they're just kind of cool. And it's nice to have cool elements in your fantasy.
If I could just jump in on that, I think you're really sparing about your use of magic in the early books, certainly, or, you pick your moments. And is that, do you see the magic in these worlds as a force for chaos, as just another unpredictable power element? How do you approach that aspect of the story?
hard-headed, can-do, roll-up-your-sleeves engineer, and he would figure out how the magic worked, and pretty soon he would become the most powerful magician in the world because the rest of people were just learning spells by rote, and he would figure out, like, the principle behind the spells, like figuring out the law of gravity or something, and all that. And those were very popular stories. They're very entertaining stories, and they influence generations of fantasists who all sit down and they figure out magical systems. And their sort of magic is like fake science. It has laws and it has rules, and you can learn it by going to magic school. And, if I wanted to write that kind of stuff, you could write science fiction about real science. Why write this bullshit science about stuff that doesn't actually work? Magic is cooler, to my mind, when it's not a noble, when it's dangerous. You're messing with forces that you don't quite understand. Maybe you think you understand them, but they'll turn around and bite you in the ass, and you're messing with stuff that's slightly beyond human ken here. And it's not just fake science. So, I like that, too. And that's much more my approach.
Do you want to pick the question, or should I?
All right here.
So, first of all, I got to say, Blackwater was the finest hour of television that I have ever seen.
And, a lot of people had a lot to do with that, man. Our special effects guys and our actors, Peter Dinklage. I got my fingers crossed that he picks on the second Emmy in a couple weeks in LA. So, keep watching and root for him.
Fantastic. Actually, that's sort of pursuant to what I was going to ask. So, of course, one of the strongest successes of the show has been the casting, which I felt has been 100% solid across the board. So which one of the actors do you feel, or actresses, portrays their character the best compared to your vision in the books for the character?
That's, who's your favorite child? We have so many great actors who've done so well. It would be very impossible for me to pick any one as my favorite, but they've all done a great job. But certainly Peter is with his Emmy nominations and his Emmy win last year, is one who's distinguished himself. But Sean Bean was amazing as Ned. The kids are all amazing. Lena Headey playing Cersei, Gwendolyn Christie this season is Brienne. I could just go on and on. Conleth Hill playing Varys. He's just been incredible. Where do I stop? I can't. And by the way, Ron Donacci is here. I don't know, is Ron in the room? Did Ron come to this? No. But HBO has sent Ron Donacci, who played Sir Roderick Cassell, to attend the convention. And you may see him wandering around the halls. And I think he's going to join me on Monday when I do my next autograph session. So you can get Sir Roderick. We've sewed his head back on. And he looks almost normal again. Without his whiskers. The whiskers were fake.
One question following up from this gentleman's question quickly, I promise. You talked about how, in the past, how the portrayal of Osha in the TV show actually really influenced you and actually caused you to kind of look at the character in a new light as you're writing the books. Has that happened with any of the other characters, where you kind of looked at the way what the actor brought to the role and it made you conceive of a storyline or a personality element differently?
Well, there are a couple characters that are significantly different from the way I portrayed them in the books. Osha is the only one where I think it may have, in fact, later on, because although it hasn't actually yet, because I haven't gotten back to her, but Osha is still an ongoing character in the books. So Natalia Tenor's portrayal of her is quite different from the way I initially wrote her, but I think it's actually more interesting than the way I originally wrote her. And when I bring back Osha, that may indeed have an influence on me, but I'll have to see when I actually get to Osha once more. Some of the other characters, Sybil Kekele's version of Shay TV Shay is very different from book Shay. I've come to, initially I didn't like that much, but then I came to, particularly in the episodes late in the second season, really like TV Shay. But there's not a question of that having any influence on future portrayals. I won't say more than that. So, that's just a question of which version do you like better. But certainly they're two different characters. And literally in the case of Jane Westerling / Talisa, it is a completely different character. So that's not even, two different versions of the same character. It's a different character and a different storyline there. But also that's not I don't know. I shouldn't say more about that.
So you can't tell me whether she is Jane Westerling? I'm still confused a little bit about that.
Well, she's the character. She's not.
She's filling that role.
My guess is that the producers decided that it wasn't satisfying to have Rob stake so much on a relationship that was entirely off stage in the books. That they wanted to put that choice in.
Yeah, well, there are a number of decisions there. I mean, yes, the first decision was we want to see Rob. We have a great young actor playing him in Richard Madden. He's very popular. In Clash of Kings, Rob is almost entirely off stage. There's some scenes in the beginning of the book, and then he goes galloping off, and every so often a raven comes in and tells us what Rob is up to. And then, of course, in Storm of Swords, Rob shows up and says, "Hi, Ma, I'm married." So they wanted to show that. And, of course, in the books, we learn what is the history, what happened to him, but we learn about it after the fact and third hand and through letters and ravens and so forth. They wanted to actually show that decision. So I think that was a good choice. But then there was a second decision, which is what they showed. I mean, they could have showed the events as they happened in the book, but for whatever reason, they came up with a different thread and changed the character of Jane Westerling significantly. It was actually my suggestion that they change her name, because once they gave her the backstory where she was not the daughter of a Lannister bannerman, but actually was this sort of healer, nurse, battlefield nurse healer from Volantis, I said, well, Jane is not a Volantine name, so if you're gonna, if we're gonna have a different character, we should have a different name for her as well. Otherwise, people are gonna get really confused here. So,
this lady right here.
You really already answered my question, because I do find it very fascinating. I'm sure we all do, that as an author, you're in a very, very unique position of having to complete your series at the same time knowing that you're going to have to also write episodes and change things. And how does that affect your creative process as you write the novel?
Well, so far it hasn't much. When I write the novels, it's like the rest of the world vanishes, and I'm living in Westeros, and these characters are real to me. And I know the TV show is out there, sure, but it doesn't impact me. I've been living with these. I started writing this in 1991, so as people ask me too whether I see the actors now in my mind's eye, and I don't. Much as I love the actors are great, but and I understand why other people would, why you might now, if you pick up the book and read about Ned, why you might see Sean Bean. But I've been living with Ned since 1991, and with Arya and with Daenerys, and they have very strong images in my head, and those are not necessarily the images of the actors. So I'm just too close to this material. The material is too much part of me to be affected by anything like that. The main impact is, of course, a certain increase of just what I needed, a little more pressure. I am laying the tracks, and the locomotive is coming down behind me here, and I'm still got quite a few tracks ahead, but I can see the smoke coming from 3 valleys away, and I can hear the occasional whistle as it's coming along.
How was your time, Mo?
I think we have
another half hour, right? 90 minutes?
10 minutes.
10 minutes?
That's what I thought too.
Okay. 10 minutes? When do we stop?
It's 15-minute breaks in between the panels.
Oh, okay.
The lady with the silver hair has had my attention most of the panel, so.
A question, the character Marjorie, in the book, she's younger and not really involved, at least my impression, in the politics of what the family is doing. But in the TV show, she's older and very much a manipulator of what's going on. How did they consult you on that change, and how do you feel about it?
Well, it's we did look at some younger Marjories, but Natalie Dormer was so fantastic that that we decided to go with them. And I love that casting choice, man. She was in The Tudors. If any of you watched that, Tudors was I think first season had a few problems, but then it really picked up steam, and it was a great show, except for the lead. But if you disregard the guy playing Henry VIII, the wives were all fantastic, especially Natalie Dormer as Anne Boleyn, and she's amazing. But of course, she is older than Sir Loras, which is the reverse. In the books, Sir Loras is a year older than Marjorie. So it has affected the character somewhat.
I always assumed that the youth of the characters, Rob is 15 when his father is taken prisoner?
Yeah.
I always assumed that the youth of the characters might be true to medieval times. People got started earlier because they lived much less longer. Is that grammatically correct? And I assumed that you generally raised the age for the TV show because it just would have been hard for us to look at a 15-year-old leading an army and not be skeptical. Not to mention the sexual situations that many people get into.
The sexual situation was a huge part of it, probably the principal part of it. I mean, it was the Daenerys question. In the book, she's 13 years old when we pick her up. She's pregnant at 14, and you cannot legally portray that on TV. That's not legal, and we also were filming in Britain, so British law obeys, and in some ways it's even more stringent than American law. Even if we cast a 17-year-old actress portraying a 13-year-old girl, that would have been a violation of British obscenity laws. So instead of a 17-year-old playing a 13-year-old, we have a 22-year-old playing a 17-year-old. But if you're going to age up Daenerys, because everything ties into what happened, during Robert's Rebellion and the sack of King's Landing and the Battle of the Trident, then you have to age up all of the characters. But I think the question that you mentioned there about, yes, believability is another question. Although it's frustrating because, as you say, it did happen. It happened all through history. There were plenty of young lords who led armies at 14 and 15 and won battles and all that. The whole concept of adolescence, as we have that in our modern society, is a modern construct. There was no such concept of being a teenager in the ancient world or the medieval world. There were coming of age ceremonies, and when you came of age, you were of age and you were an adult. We still have, remnants of that. Of course, Jewish people have the bar mitzvah, and today I am a man. The 13-year-old says, I believe, and
what was exactly my wording.
And today I am a man, so now I will go out and
back to the 8th grade.
Get married, drive and drink. No, you won't. You won't. You'll go right back to being this sort of, child. And Catholicism, where I was raised, has a similar rite, the confirmation rite, which also takes place at 13, where you are expected to confirm as an adult the vows that were taken for you when you were baptized by other people, by your godparents as a child. Now you confirm them as the confirmation thing because you're all grown up at 13. So we still have the rites, we just don't believe in them anymore. We've created this whole artificial thing of teenagerdom. And I don't know, I suppose it's a sign of modern society where we keep pushing off adulthood further and further.
I still haven't gotten there.
More
And
questions?
The number of 27-year-olds still living in their parents' basements is an alarming sign that pretty soon it's going to be 30 before you're allowed to move out.
This is not a convention to scold people for not growing up. Am I right, people? Come on, let's all finish here and go buy some more toys.
This gentleman.
Just how unstable is the orbit of the planet? I mean, we have winters lasting 20, 30
It's
years.
fantasy. Orbital mechanics get nothing to do with it.
They last as long as George says they
The
last.
moon is made of cheese. How about right here?
You mentioned that you're writing, you write a couple of chapters about a character, and then you move on. Which character do you feel most at home writing?
Tyrion. Arya, too. Arya is a lot of fun. I could write a whole novel about Arya and Bravos, which I've been She's just, she's just fun to write about.
Well, it seems like a recurring with both of those characters, who I think really resonate for a lot of people who read the books. You're fascinated with people who are perceived as outsiders, or someone who's not. You don't say, well, you don't normally in the course of life think, wow, the 10-year-old girl is really going to kick everyone's ass. Like, that's not something that's like the expected thing. Or have you had, not to get psychoanalytical here at the end of the panel, but have you felt like an outsider? Is that something that just kind of is a part of your makeup?
Sure. I mean, I suspect that's true of almost everyone in the hall here at a science fiction community. One of the great things about coming into fandom is, the sense that I certainly had, and I know a lot of fans have, I found my people at last. Because you've previously been in a lot of situations in high school and college and whatever, where you were the odd one, the, what used to be called nerds or geeks or all that. Before that was a term of pride and something that people self-identified with. It was pejorative, used to put one down. But I would say like 90% of the characters in Ice and Fire are misfits in one way or another. They are, Jon Snow is a bastard, Tyrion is a dwarf, Arya is the tomboy who doesn't fulfill her proper social roles. Dany is an exile who's lost everything. Sam is fat and rejected by his father, and you go on and on through the list. Brienne is another character who's, freakishly tall and manly, and therefore rejected as not fulfilling her proper roles. And I just find those characters fascinating to write about, and how people deal with that kind of. How do I find my place in society? Do I try to conform to what I'm supposed to be? Do I reject it? Do I carve out a new place for myself? And Tyrion, probably the one who's thought about it most, and he gives Jon Snow the advice to hear about, know what you are, accept what you are, and never forget what you are, because the world will not.
Just so we're clear, you're pro freakishly tall ladies. I'd say me.
That's a thumbs up on that. Can we do one more question? This guy right here.
What would you say to people who have read the books and they read all of the characters' chapters in order and then go back and read another character's chapter in order? That's how my friend read it. He unfortunately did not love the books as much as I have. And I wonder if that is why. Do you have any comments on that?
My sister, when I was growing up, would eat her peas first, and then her mashed potatoes, and then her meat. And she would never alternate them. And she didn't like them to touch on the plate either. So I, on the other hand, would take my mashed potatoes and sort of make a volcano out of them, and put the butter in the middle so it melted, and the peas on top of it, and smoosh it all together. And so I'm much more of a smoosh all the characters together and eat them all at once than eat them separately.
I don't think we're going to find a better ending for the panel.